Now, we would like to call upon Professor Jeffrey Sachs from as the Director, Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and Director of the Earth Institute, Columbia University. Professor Sachs, please take the podium.
Make sure I know how to do this. These? And back? Okay, very good. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here at the IGES conference at ISAP 2015. Last year I was able to join by video, and this year much better in person. And it is indeed a great pleasure and honor. It's also a great pleasure to be here without a tie. So I want to congratulate Japan on cool biz. If we could make a global revolution so we don't have to wear the ties anymore, I think all the men here would be very happy. So I want to thank the conference for making us so comfortable and enabling us to be together. We are here, as you've just heard, at a very important time, because now we're within 60 days of the world adopting the Sustainable Development Goals, having been discussed now for 3 intensive years. And I think the expectations are quite high, and they should be, because these new goals are extremely important. And I want to explain in just the few minutes that I have why they're so important and why I'm extraordinarily pleased that today IGES and UN University and other partners will also be launching the Sustainable Development Solutions Network for Japan, which is a part of a global network launched by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to promote the achievement of the new Sustainable Development Goals. We should define our terms, although I know everybody here knows them well. Sustainable development started 30 years ago as a concept that emphasized the intergenerational justice when Dr. Brundtland's famous commission first defined sustainable development. It was defined in terms of each generation meeting its needs in a way that would enable later generations to meet their needs. Over time, the definition has evolved, and I think it has evolved in a way which becomes more accessible and understandable to the public. The definition of sustainable development that underpins the new Sustainable Development Goals is that sustainable development is a holistic approach to society that emphasizes the integration of economic, social, and environmental objectives. And so the idea of sustainable development is a new kind of economic growth in which there is continued economic progress, continued economic development, and certainly for the developing countries to have the space and the freedom to narrow the gap and catch up with the high-income countries. But for all countries to achieve economic development in a way that is socially inclusive, that is, that narrows income inequalities and wealth inequalities in society, that promotes gender equality, and that promotes fairness and the end of discrimination against minorities of all kinds, and does so in a manner that is environmentally sustainable. It's a big objective, because after all, achieving economic growth has been very hard for many places. Achieving economic growth that is socially inclusive has been even harder, and almost no country has achieved economic growth that is socially inclusive and environmentally sustainable. It's almost without exception that countries around the world have energy systems and therefore industrial systems that are still not compatible with the stabilization of the climate and with the stabilization of other environmental objectives. This year, though sustainable development is not a new concept, it's a concept that has been with us since the Rio Earth Summit in 1992 and really has been on the global agenda at least since 1987, since the Brundtland Commission. This year is perhaps our most intensive, organized, high-profile attempt to put sustainable development at the center of global cooperation. Because while we thought 23 years ago that had been accomplished in Rio at the Earth Summit, we look back and we see how far we fell short of putting sustainable development truly in the thinking and in the planning and in the processes and in the ethics of global development. The world has become richer but less sustainable during the period since Rio. And the whole reason why we have sustainable development goals proposed is that we are far off track. There is one piece of important good news. Not everything is bleak by any means. And especially in Asia, where this truth has been most important and most relevant, we should take note, champion it, and build upon it. And that is the significant reduction of extreme poverty in the past generation. This was the focus of the preceding goals, which finished this September, the Millennium Development Goals, which were adopted in September 2000 at the United Nations, and were really an experiment to try to give more attention to shared global objectives. And in particular, in September 2000, the member states of the United Nations adopted the goal of fighting extreme poverty in all its forms: income poverty, hunger poverty, lack of access to education, gender inequality, discrimination against girls and women, and a heavy disease burden among the poorest people in the world. So the SDGs were adopted 15 years ago, and we can now celebrate that some significant progress has been made. Of course, the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, were not by any means the whole story, and for many places not even the main story of that progress. But the MDGs certainly helped to focus attention and improve policy making. What we know is that the measured rate of income poverty, as calculated by the World Bank, fell from 43% of the population of developing countries in 1990 to 21% of the population of developing countries in 2010. And while we don't have good up-to-date data, the trend suggests that we're somewhere around 15% by now, by 2015. Of course, China made the most spectacular progress, with extreme poverty falling from 60%, hard to imagine, hard to believe, back in 1990, to probably about 6% today. And I should note that even in sub-Saharan Africa, which is the poorest region of the world, poverty rates have come down significantly. From the year 2000, when the MDGs were adopted, till today, poverty has probably declined in sub-Saharan Africa from around 58%, according to the World Bank's measurement, to, I would guess, somewhere around 40 to 45% today. A significant decline. Not enough, but still a very, very significant decline. That's the good news. The not so good news is that while economic growth has been robust, at least up until yesterday's stock market fall in China, which we trust is only a one-day scare, not a beginning of something much worse. While economic growth has been robust, the growth has not, on the whole, been sustainable, according to the 3 pillars of sustainable development. First, all over the world, including in China, which has been the most successful rapid growth economy of the past generation, income inequality has widened. In many ways, social inclusion or social exclusion has gotten worse for some major groups. Many young people face joblessness, or at least the lack of ability to secure decent jobs. Extreme poverty continues in much of Asia and Africa. And of course, the environmental sustainability is much further from being achieved than it was a generation ago. For many years, as I visited the world on behalf of the United Nations, I have seen unrest on the streets with my own eyes, especially unemployed young people, especially young people protesting high and rising inequality. There's a lot of tension in the world. There is not a sense of complacency or high accomplishment. There's a sense of unease and of dislocation. And we would be very profoundly mistaken to not understand how widespread these feelings are. And of course, there is a growing recognition, too slow, but now felt all over the world, that the environmental consequences of our growth and the failure to align economic development with environmental realities has become a worldwide dire crisis. The framing that I particularly like is the planetary boundaries notion that was first put forward by a group of ecologists back in 2009 and has been recently updated. And the idea of the planetary boundaries is the identification scientifically of thresholds in the Earth's systems, ecosystems, and physical systems that we are now threatening through the scale of human activity, and especially the global economic activity in the world. And in this famous picture of the planetary boundaries from 2009, at the very top of the curve, at 12 noon, is climate change. Certainly the most significant single human impact on the environment, because as we change the climate, we change every other aspect of the ecosystems and the physical processes of the Earth, the ocean, heat transport, the atmospheric patterns, the ability of species to survive in a rapidly changing and disrupted climate. As you go around the circle, other boundaries such as ocean acidification, of course, completely linked to the high use of fossil fuels, the rising concentration of carbon dioxide, and therefore the acidification of the oceans as the carbon dioxide is dissolved in the sea, is alarming. Alarming for a country like Japan, which lives on seafood and shellfish. Alarming for the whole world, where marine ecosystems are tremendously threatened by this ocean acidity. As one goes around this circle, at 4 and 5 o'clock are the nitrogen and phosphorus fluxes or loadings in the environment coming from the massive use of fertilizer that is necessary to feed the 7.3 billion people on the planet. We don't feed billions of people very well, indeed. But this fertilizer use is having a major disruption on the ecosystems, especially the nitrogen and phosphorus loadings, leading to mass eutrophication and hypoxic zones in major rivers and estuaries around the world. There is freshwater depletion, massive change of land use, and what scientists call the sixth great extinction process of the planet, the loss of biodiversity, with millions of species threatened through land use change, pollution, climate change, diversion of water resources, invasive species, and many other human impacts on the environment. And we are so thankful for Naoko Ishii, who is here, Japan's contribution to the world biodiversity conservation as head of the Global Environment Facility, and who will be speaking here momentarily, whose agency, the Global Environment Facility, needs and merits all our support to be in the forefront of this fight to preserve biodiversity. And yet the world has not appreciated yet how dire this threat is. The news is not good on the environmental front. I would say that every month brings new alarming data. Every week, a scientist at the Earth Institute, where I'm privileged to be director, comes up to me and says, "Jeff, it's worse than we thought. There's a new finding, a new study. Things are accelerating beyond our expectation." And June of this year was just declared the warmest June in the 136 years of instrument record on the planet, since 1879. And May was the warmest year on instrument record, and April was the warmest month on instrument record for April. We're going to have the warmest year in history this year in 2015. And what some had claimed to be a, quote, hiatus or a pause in warming turns out to have been a statistical aberration. The warming is continuing just as the climate science predicted. It's continuing rapidly. It is pushing the Earth into conditions that we have never experienced as a species before. One could look at hundreds of dislocations and disruptions around the world. I was just with Governor Brown of California a couple of days ago. He was describing the intense drought that the state of California is now experiencing. And here you see a water reservoir completely dried up. California is in the midst of one of its most extreme droughts in modern history. That is a very advanced economy, and yet it is reeling under the environmental stresses. And this is happening all over the world. My climate science guru and colleague, Dr. James Hansen, who for 30 years was the US government's chief climate scientist until he retired this past year and took a professorship at Columbia University, just this past week published another alarming study. When Professor Hansen is your colleague, you are always up to date, but you are always terrified because he never brings good news. He only brings more and more alarming news. So this week's study shows why we are now in a pattern on a current trajectory to have a several meter rise of sea levels, and shows that the last time we were in the range of the temperatures that we are now fast approaching, the so-called Eemian period, which was 130,000 years ago, the sea level was 6 meters higher than today. And what Professor Hansen explains in his new paper this week is how the ice shelf of West Antarctica is being destroyed by warming from below. And it will break off, and it will lead to a faster disruption of the West Antarctica ice sheet than has been expected, meaning that the time scale for the several meter rise of sea levels is not hundreds and hundreds of years, but could be a matter of decades and could well be in the course of this century. And there's plenty of corroborating evidence for that. And what NASA has done is to show the implications of this. And the red areas are the areas that would be lost to a 6-meter rise of sea level. And I apologize to my colleagues here from Bangladesh sitting here. Your whole country is underwater in this picture. We can't even imagine the scale of disruption. Japan, my own city, New York City, the world's major cities around the world, what we are not taking heed by our failure to take seriously the climate disruptions that we have underway. We will adopt the Sustainable Development Goals in September. There are 17 of them. I can verify that if you practice for an hour or two, you can remember them. I thought it was impossible, but if you stand in front of a mirror, you can get all 17 of them in a pretty short period of time. I encourage everybody to remember them so that when your mother, your child, your cousin asks you, what is SDG 13, you'll be able to tell them immediately that's to stop climate change. And when they say, well, what is SDG 11, you'll be able to say that is for urban sustainability. How about SDG 7? That is for renewable, sustainable energy. SDG 3 for universal health coverage. These are worthy goals. They are goals within reach, as we'll discuss in our panel in just a few minutes. And they will soon become the world's goals. I want to point out in the couple of minutes remaining, and I do understand I have a couple minutes left because we missed one speaker, so I will go on just for a couple of minutes and take the prerogative if you'll let me. I was closely calculating. I want to explain one aspect of the SDGs, SDG 13. The trajectory for the world's emissions is given by the top line here, the business as usual path of the IPCC reference pathways, RCP 8.5 so-called. It puts us on a disastrous course of warming. The trajectory that we need over the course of the century to have a likely chance of keeping below 2 degrees Celsius, which may not even be enough to stabilize the ocean level, is the bottom blue path. We have to decarbonize the world's energy system, decarbonize by around 2070. That means zero net emissions of CO2 from the world's energy system by around 2070. We're emitting around 5 tons per capita now. We have to get to net zero by around 2070. That's a hard challenge. That means we need very deep decarbonization. This can be accomplished through the combination of energy efficiency, zero carbon electricity, and electrification of the transport fleet and of our buildings. Japan faces major challenges because Japan's emissions per capita right now are about 9 tons of CO2 per capita. We have to get down to zero by around 2070. Japan has major choices of how to do that. Will it continue to use nuclear energy, for example? How will the transport fleet work? The good news for Japan is that it has some of the world's leading companies and scientists that can do this. If anybody can produce zero-emission vehicles, I'd guess that Toyota would be right at the front. And so the question of how to do this is extremely important and pertinent for Japan and for all of Asia. The SDSN has been promoting a deep decarbonization pathways project, and IGES has been part of that. because we have the wonderful participation of Dr. Mikiko Kainuma, who is part of the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project, the global project. So the idea is that we need to engage engineers and scientists, economists, energy specialists, major companies around the world to find the pathways to deep decarbonization rapidly. Now, this map shows who produces the innovations in the world. And I do want to stress that we have three major innovative regions, in a way competing and in a way cooperating with each other. Of course, we'd like to see more such regions. But the East Asian region where we are now, Western Europe, and the United States are the three major patenting regions. We depend on these regions to help lead the new technologies for sustainable development. And what's interesting for me is that this region, and I'm going to count Northeast Asia, China, Japan, and Korea, has become the largest economic zone of the whole world and the largest patenting zone of the whole world. And so if China, Korea, and Japan can cooperate together peacefully and economically, this is the powerhouse for a great part of the innovation that we're going to need in this century to solve the problems of sustainable development. So finally, let me introduce briefly the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. This is an initiative launched by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon back in 2012 when the world adopted the concept of the Sustainable Development Goals. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon greatly honored me by asking me to help establish this network as a network of the world's universities, think tanks, and research laboratories in partnership with business, government, and civil society to help promote problem solving, new solutions, knowledge-led sustainable development around the world. This is a almost up-to-date map. There are so many new members joining and new chapters being organized, but this gives an idea of the reach of this new Sustainable Development Solutions Network. I was recently in Germany to help launch the German SDSN, in Chile to launch the Chile SDSN, in Ecuador to launch the Andean region SDSN. I'm thrilled that in Yokohama today we will launch the SDSN for Japan, and next Monday in Manila, the SDSN for the Philippines. This is a global cooperative effort to promote knowledge-based sustainable development. We will also be launching an urban alliance for the SDGs under the partnership of SDSN and other institutions at the UN headquarters on September 24th, the day before the Sustainable Development Goals are adopted. So we're encouraging cities to sign up. This past week at the Vatican, Pope Francis invited about 80 mayors from around the world to come to the Vatican to commit to sustainable development. And we had a wonderful meeting, and at the end of the meeting, agreed to launch an urban alliance for the Sustainable Development Goals. So today we will launch the Japan SDN Chapter. I want to mention some of the things quickly that I hope we work on. Deep decarbonization for Japan and the Asia region. High technology solutions for energy efficiency and low carbon energy, and Japan has great expertise in these areas. The use of robotics and information technology to promote sustainable development. New urban design strategies for Asia's mega cities so that they are efficient, they are healthful, they are good places to live, and they are environmentally sustainable. Advanced nanotechnologies and biotechnologies, green chemistry, again, where Japan has great expertise and excellence, and also the challenges of aging and well-being. Japan is aging first in the world. It's pioneering this. This is good news. Every year I like aging more, I have to say. You know, it's a good concept. And Japan has the longest life expectancy in the world. This is a tribute to this society in many, many ways. Its peacefulness, its high level of organization, its technological sophistication, its high equality in society, its wonderful cuisine, and its wonderful health practices as well, and healthcare system. So Japan has a life expectancy that exceeds all other parts of the world. But it also means that Japan is aging, and it's going to pioneer how aging societies can thrive and flourish as well. And this is also part of sustainable development, and I think another way that our new network launched today can make a major contribution. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sachs. So with this, we conclude keynote speech.